That footage you just saw is real. A woman in a corset, standing in a painted garden. She reaches behind an oversized cabbage, she pulls out a living baby, she sets it on the ground like produce. Then she does it again. That film is from 1900. It is the oldest surviving narrative film in existence. The woman playing the fairy is Yvonne Mugnier-Serand. The director is Alice Guy Blache. And nobody talks about why this particular story was the first one cinema ever told. February 1896. Paris. A 22-year-old secretary named Alice Guy walks down Boulevard Poissonnière. She is heading toward the cabarets of Montmartre. But she stops at a storefront she has never noticed before. The windows are lit. Inside, against the wall, are rows of glass and metal boxes. Inside those boxes are living human babies, premature infants, some small enough to fit in a man's palm. They are lying in machines modeled after chicken egg incubators, because that is exactly what they are. The inventor, a French engineer named Alexandre Lion, patented this device on October 28, 1889. He based it on poultry equipment, and he funded the entire operation by charging the public admission to come watch newborns fight for their lives. 50,000 visitors paid to see these babies in the first year alone. Alice Guy was one of them. Her granddaughter, Regine Blache-Bolton, confirmed this decades later. Alice walked into that storefront, saw infants displayed in glass boxes for paying strangers, and 3 months later created the first narrative film ever recorded. A fairy harvesting babies from a cabbage garden. The Art Nouveau poster advertising Lyon's exhibition makes the connection even more explicit. Designed by Adolfo Hohenstein, it shows a nurse cradling 3 infants. Behind her, vines sprout baby heads in place of flowers. Drawings of children growing like botanical specimens fill the background. This poster hung on the streets of Paris in 1896. Babies depicted as things that grow on plants, not born, grown. That visual language appeared on a Paris boulevard before the postcards, before the dolls, before any of it. Now here is where most people who have covered this topic start. The postcards. Between 1900 and 1920, hundreds of thousands of postcards flooded Europe and North America, showing babies growing in cabbage patches. Babies being pulled from the earth like vegetables. Babies tended by gardeners and delivered to couples who browsed through them like shoppers selecting fruit. These were not produced by a single company running a campaign. They came from dozens of studios across Germany, France, Russia, Spain, Britain, and the United States. Multiple languages, multiple artistic styles, no documented coordinating source. Art historians classify them as whimsical birth announcements, sentimental imagery, harmless folklore. And they are partially right. In France, children had been told for centuries that boys come from cabbage patches and girls from rose bushes. French parents still call their babies mon petit chou, my little cabbage. In Scotland, children placed cabbage leaves outside to ask fairies for siblings. In Ireland, you were told you were found under a stalk of cabbage. The folklore is old and widespread, so let me address this directly. Maybe the postcards are exactly what our historians say they are. Birth announcements based on folk tradition. Charming, innocent, unconnected to anything darker. If this were the whole picture, I would accept that explanation and move on. But the timeline refuses to stay innocent. Because during the exact decades these postcards circulated, between 1900 and 1920, the largest mass displacement of children in American history was underway, and the scale of it is difficult to process. September 20, 1854. A train pulls out of New York City carrying 46 children. They range from infants to 12 years old. No parents are with them. No family waits at the destination. When they arrive in Dowagiac, Michigan, they are lined up on a railroad platform. Local families walk past, inspect them, and choose which ones to take home. This is the first orphan train. The last train departs on May 31st, 1929, carrying 3 children to Sulphur Springs, Texas. By then, between 200,000 and 250,000 children will have been transported this way. At peak volume, 3,000 to 4,000 children per year were shipped west. The first agent, E.P. Smith, let passengers adopt boys without checking references. He played on audience sympathy, pointing out that boys were handy and girls could be used for all types of housework. Many of these children were used strictly as farm labor. Many were not orphans at all. They were children of immigrants and poor families. The co-founders of the program later acknowledged this. The children traveled for days in uncomfortable conditions, sometimes on trains barely better than cattle cars. 2 or 3 adult chaperones supervised 30 to 40 children at a time. When they arrived, they had no birth certificates, no verified family histories, no provable identity. An estimated 2 million descendants are alive today, many of whom still cannot trace their lineage past the train platform. Where did they come from? The Cabbage Patch. That was the answer the culture gave. Not literally, but functionally. The mythology did the same work as a shrug. And the orphan trains were only the American chapter. Across the Atlantic, the system was older and larger. The foundling wheel, called the ruota in Italy, was a rotating wooden cylinder built into the wall of a hospital or church. A woman could place her infant inside, ring a bell, and the staff on the other side would rotate the wheel to receive the child. Anonymous. No questions, no records of the parent. The first one was installed in Rome in 1198. By the 1400s, they had spread across Catholic Europe. By the 1800s, the numbers are staggering. Over 100,000 foundlings abandoned annually across the continent. In France, Italy, and Spain, as many as 1 in 3 babies born in cities was deposited into these institutions. France alone had 251 foundling wheels at their peak, legalized on January 19, 1811. The death rate inside these foundling hospitals averaged 80%. In some years it approached 100%. Children who survived were renamed. In Italy, they were called Esposito, meaning exposed. In Milan, they were named Colombo, after the pigeons outside the foundling home. In France, they were called Trouvé, found. Parents sometimes left a token, a ribbon, a coin, a piece of torn fabric, hoping to reclaim the child someday. Most never returned. So now hold the timeline in your mind. 198, the first foundling wheel is installed in Rome. By the 1700s, boys from cabbages, girls from roses is the standard explanation given to children across France. 1811, France legalizes 251 foundling wheels. 1854, the first orphan train leaves New York. 1863, France begins closing its foundling wheels. 1869, Sister Mary Irene Fitzgibbon places a cradle on a Manhattan stoop to receive abandoned babies, founding the New York Foundling Hospital. 1889, Alexander Lyon patents his baby incubator, modeled on chicken egg equipment. February 1896, Alice Guy visits Lyon's incubator exhibition on Boulevard Poissonnière and sees babies in glass boxes displayed for paying strangers. Spring 1896, she films La Fée aux Choux. The first narrative film in history is about harvesting babies from a garden. That same year, incubator babies are exhibited at the Berlin Exposition under the name Kinderbrutenstalt. That word translates to child hatchery. 1900 to 1920, cabbage baby postcards flood the Western world. 1903, Martin Cooney opens his permanent incubator exhibit at Coney Island, displaying premature infants next to sword swallowers and sideshow acts. He charges 25 cents admission. He runs it for 40 years. Each piece connects to the next, each decade adds another layer, and every layer uses the same language. Children as things that are grown, harvested, displayed, selected, and distributed. Not born to families, delivered to them, by fairies, by gardeners, by institutions. I need to be honest about something. I sat with this research for almost a week before I started writing. Not because the facts were hard to find. They are well documented. The orphan trains have a PBS documentary. The foundling wheels are in medical journals. Alice Guy Blash's visit to the incubator exhibition is confirmed by her own granddaughter. The problem was not evidence. The problem was that every time I laid the timeline out, I could hear how it would sound. I could hear reasonable people saying I was forcing a pattern onto unrelated events. And I kept asking myself whether that was true. Whether folklore is just folklore. Whether postcards are just postcards. Whether the fact that all of this clusters in the same decades across the same countries is simply what coincidence looks like at scale. But then I found what Salvador Dali said about the postcards. Dali collected them. So did André Breton. So did Paul Eluard, who called them a Lilliputian hallucination of the world. Dali called them the most lively document of popular modern thought, a thought so profound or so sharp that it eludes psychoanalysis. The surrealists did not collect them as whimsy. They collected them because they recognized something in the imagery that resisted easy explanation. A British art dealer named James Birch began collecting them in Aix-en-Provence. He later found a display case of them at the Pompidou Center, exhibited for their inspirational importance to the Dadaists and Surrealists. He published a book called Babylon, Surreal Babies in 2010. Even the art world knew these postcards carried something heavier than charm. And the postcards were not gentle. Some of them show babies being sold, some reference lotteries of children, some depict gardeners tending rows of infants while couples browse and point. The imagery is commercial, transactional. It mirrors the mechanics of the foundling system and the orphan trains with disturbing precision. Babies appear from the earth. They have no parents, no origin story, no history. Someone selects them, someone takes them home. This is not what a birth announcement looks like. This is what displacement looks like when a culture has agreed to call it something else. The medical establishment during this era makes the picture darker. Martin Cooney, the man who ran baby incubator exhibits at Coney Island for 4 decades, likely never held a legitimate medical license. He fabricated his credentials because the real medical profession refused to help premature babies at all. A Chicago doctor produced a film advocating for letting them die, tagged "Kill Defectives, Save the Nation." The Boston Medical and Surgical Journal questioned in 1901 whether saving premature infants was even worthwhile. The eugenics movement called them weaklings who would pollute the gene pool. In this environment, the only way to save a premature baby was to display it in a glass box at an amusement park. Cooney saved over 6,500 lives this way. His nurse, Madame Recht, would slide a diamond ring up a baby's arm to the shoulder to show audiences how small the infants were. When Cooney died, his death certificate did not mention medicine. Neither did Alexandre Lyon's. Lion, the man whose invention inspired the first movie ever made, was described on his death certificate in 1934 as a wandering salesman. 80 years after the postcards faded from circulation, the story came back. In 1976, a 21-year-old Georgia art student named Xavier Roberts discovered dolls at a craft fair made by a Kentucky folk artist named Martha Nelson Thomas. Thomas had been making what she called doll babies since the early 1970s. Each one came with a birth certificate and adoption papers. Roberts purchased her dolls, then began making his own when Thomas cut him off. He renamed them Little People. A licensing agent named Roger Schleifer renamed them Cabbage Patch Kids in 1982 and created the origin mythology. The official story said Xavier Roberts was a 10-year-old boy who followed a bunny bee behind a waterfall into a magical cabbage patch where babies were being born. Roberts sold the dolls from Babyland General Hospital, a converted abandoned medical clinic in Georgia. He did not sell them, you adopted them. Each doll came with a unique birth certificate and adoption papers, no parents listed. Born in a cabbage patch. Martha Nelson Thomas, the woman who actually created the concept, sued Roberts. They settled out of court in 1985 for an undisclosed amount. Her name disappeared from the product. Sound familiar? Coleco Mass produced them in 1983. 3 million sold by the end of that year. 20 million in 1984. $2 billion in retail sales. Americans physically fought each other in stores to adopt these dolls. Dolls with no parents, born from cabbages, distributed through a converted hospital. The entire apparatus of the foundling system compressed into a toy. And nobody noticed what the story was actually about because the story had been telling itself for 800 years. Every culture needs a narrative to explain what it cannot say plainly. You do not tell a child their sibling was deposited in a wooden box in a church wall by a mother who could not afford to feed them. You tell the child their sibling was found in the cabbage patch. You do not tell a community that 250,000 children were stripped of their identities and shipped across a continent. You send postcards of babies growing in gardens, tended by fairies, delivered to loving homes. The fairy tale does the work of erasure. It always has. Alice Guy Blash saw babies in glass boxes on a Paris boulevard and turned the experience into the first story cinema ever told. That story was about a fairy pulling children from a garden. The original 1896 film is now lost. 90% of all films made before 1929 are gone. We preserved almost nothing from the birth of cinema. The one film that might tell us what the culture was processing when it chose this story, as its first, has vanished. The postcards are in museum archives. The orphan train records are in genealogical databases. The foundling wheel mechanisms still sit in the walls of old hospitals across Europe. The Cabbage Patch Kids are in attics and storage units across America, each one with its adoption certificate still tucked inside. And somewhere between folklore and documentation, between fairy tale and institutional record, there is a question no one has properly asked. What story does a civilization tell itself when it needs to explain where all the children came from? What mythology does it build when the truth is too large, too systemic, too uncomfortable for a direct answer? And when that mythology appears in the first film, the most popular postcards, and the best-selling toy of the 20th century, all using the same image: babies without parents, harvested from a garden. What exactly are we looking at? A coincidence that spans 8 centuries and 6 continents, or the longest-running cover story in Western history?